In the Gerber Compassion talk, there was a mention of the golden rule. Now, I was raised a capitalist, so it's he who has the gold makes the rules. But I heard a better formulation of the normal version. So instead of do to somebody else the way that you would like to be treated, it's do to other people how they want to be treated. If I am a masochist, I want to be struck and hit and all of that other stuff. And this guy probably isn't like that. So I think it's it may sound about the same, but it does have a new idea, and it requires communication where the golden rule does not. So it's not as easy.
Yeah, I mean, the golden rule was written for kindergarten students, right? So this is sort of more on a more global human population, 2.5 billion of us. So yeah, I want to see the world a certain way. Allow me to do so. It's not going to be done to your rights. That's, I guess, where the line is drawn. Crosses over, breaks laws or that are agreed upon by whatever country you're living in, or even those laws of. I mean, you're right. I see where you're coming from. Absolutely.
I think I've even heard of a platinum rule, which is treat yourself the way that you would treat others, because we tend to treat ourselves poorly sometimes. Just variation. Any other questions?
This is for Wissam, but maybe others as well. In Christianity, we have the concept of hermeneutic, which is you extract a theme from the text. So feminists, for example, have gone through the Bible and they say, okay, let's look at every single time when there's a female character. What is that female character? And you realize these are really strong women, often asserting leadership. And so anybody who says this is patriarchal text is obviously not reading the text. This is a hermeneutic. Other people have gone through and said, let us look at every single time that rich and powerful people are in confrontation with people who are poor or not powerful. In every single case, not one exception, God is on the side of the poor and the weak against the strong, even if the poor and the weak are behaving badly. This is the liberation theology hermeneutic. I wonder if Islam has anything comparable to this approach for extracting a thematic meaning from the text.
I think every sect, every philosophy, this list that Bakr has displayed with all the branches of Islam, I think every one of them does that. Even the group, I think he can speak to that because she has more knowledge about this. But even groups who are LGBTQ Muslims, they even extract legitimization from the Quran itself. So it has that. It seems that humanity in general have always found its ways to make the text whatever to get from it whatever they want. So yes, this is also available in Islam. Although I want to bring back the point that Ibrahim started the conference with, and that many Muslims ignore, because they say, oh yeah, we have interpretations for this, we have interpretations for that, but at the end of the day, the clarity of the text with its emotional power is going to be the dominant force. And that's why it is much easier for extremist groups, because the text aligns sometimes with their agenda, to recruit and to, if you open videos that were created by ISIS, and they were very good at video making, and I'm not talking about the violent videos, I'm talking about videos that they spread among each other to cultivate their philosophy. It is 60-70% recitation of verses, because the verses just align to their agenda. So interpretation is always when a verse says, for example, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, and beat them as the last resort for disobedient wife, that text will always be stronger than any interpretation, because interpretation is intellectual, it's processing, it is hearing what, it's listening to or understanding what you're not hearing, and that takes more process than the strength of the word. So we have to also recognize that with all these interpretations, with all these selective, you take thematic, actually in Irshad we're working on what would you call it, tafsir al-mawdu' al-Quran, like chapters from the Quran, like the Quran of women, the Quran of life, the Quran of coexistence, picking up, like you're saying, picking up the verses that support this philosophy and this spirit and listing them together in a book. And this effort is great, but we have to also understand that as long as we are closing down the questioning and the acceptability of selectiveness from the book will always win. And it will, the clearness of the text, the direct text will always come back to haunt you in one way or another.
I think, to answer your question, there was an Egyptian scholar, 20 years ago. His name is Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. He tried to apply hermeneutics and new ways of looking at the Quranic text, and actually he was excommunicated, he was divorced from his wife, and he ended up leaving Egypt for just doing that. It's just, I think it goes back to the idea of who has a monopoly of translating and interpreting these texts, because there are structures of power that rely on these interpretations. He tried to use these new ways of hermeneutics, or the specific meanings related to how to interpret, text, which are Western ways of looking at it, but it wasn't successful. So I think there will be a lot of resistance from the powers, especially like Al-Azhar and in Iran or Saudi Arabia, for these kind of things. And Wissam knows better, but I think it goes back to the idea of whether the Quran is old or new, and if it's not old as God is old, so actually it's a product that we can interpret and kind of tweak it or play with it. But I think a lot of people would refuse that.
Just one thing. I recently learned of a group doing something of that sort with regards to liberation theology and trying to apply that to addressing and resolving and remedying intimate partner violence, particularly in queer Muslim relationships. So there's folks who are way at the bottom of the totem pole, totally marginalized and oppressed, who are still taking up those same trains of thought and trying to use that knowledge and apply it for their own liberation still. So past examples, but even modern day ones to continue.
What's the name of the group?
I wish I could tell you. They're still very in the early stages, just sort of forming, but I'd love to share info when they get something together and disperse it.
Question for Sam. I'm so glad you brought up Abdel Razak, because I think that there has been a tendency when we're talking about reform that we're always looking at reforming by reinterpreting scripture. And I think meanwhile, there have been a lot of really important secular thinkers who have been disappeared. I mean, you don't learn much when you go, even in the context of American University. A lot of the professorships are actually, we're constantly thinking of reform or of justice in terms of what's in the Quran. There's verses that talk about social justice, as if we don't have other traditions like socialism in the Arab world, and that you have entire histories and traditions that are not being taught, and texts that are not readily available to us. So somebody who's very much involved in education, what are the ways that you think that we can actually begin to reclaim these texts and to reintroduce them and to maybe also reinterpret and look at them and see how they can also help us reform and work for causes such as income inequality, social justice, the rights of minorities, and also now the catastrophic climate change?
That's a big question, and with I'm not putting any hope in our in Arabic countries or Islamic efforts from the Middle East for such causes. But for us as Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Muslim Europeans, living in the West with access to academic institutions, I think the encouragement of our children, of our community, to seek academic degrees. I mean, our universities are full of debate about these subjects today. I mean, the University of Oxford has the best Islamic research now, like, in the world, one of the best. If you want to read really modern Islamic research and articles, they're coming from the top universities in the West. So I think encouraging our communities to seek academic degrees where they can focus. I mean, there is an Orientalist, a French scholar, whose PhD was made on Sayyid Sheikh Mahdi al-Khalisi, Sheikh Muhammad Mahdi al-Khalisi, one of the unknown Marja'iyya, like big scholars in Shia Iraq. And I was surprised that I cannot find writings about him anywhere in the Islamic world, but I can find it in Paris. So we can play that role here by encouraging our community to study Islam from an academic point of view and dig into these resources. And these resources, many of them are actually available in Western libraries anyway. Most of the artifacts of Sheikh Muhammad Abdul is not in Egypt. It's in Paris and London and the British Library. Thank you.
So this is a question for anybody who wants to take it. What do you do when the charter of compassion is a contradiction with the teaching of the faith? What do you do? Like you have some things in the charter of compassion that are like equality and everybody, equality. Let's just keep it at equality. It's not equality between men and women. Very specific. There are certain things in the scripture that diverge from that. They're not in alignment with the charter of compassion. What do you do? How do you treat that? I'm going to leave it at that.
Me personally, living in 21st century world, I would look past whatever in scripture does not apply to today's world at all. I just, as either expired or applies to another time period of humanity. That works for me personally. I don't know what others would do or not. But that fits in with my logic.
I think what we talked earlier might talk about how science can help us come to consensus about certain universal, let's call them principles or criteria. And I think equality between men and women should be one of these things because we are at this time, and any religion or any belief that would not want to play with these rules, then they will not have a say, in the world.
But we do have.
For now, but I'm saying, if we want to change things, we have to put these principles that I said earlier, and like universal principles, and everyone has to kind of accept them. And I think one of the dangers is a moral relativism that appeared, the idea that every culture had their own relative morality and we should respect that. I agree with that, but there are certain universal things that we should abide by, and if you don't subscribe to them, then you cannot be part of the humanity for se, because it just can't, like a lot of oppression toward women, it cannot be left by the idea that, we can't talk about it because it's just kind of cultural and relativistic, and I don't believe in that. I agree with Sam Harris when he said that we have to, universalize some of these things and come to consensus about them based on more scientific criteria.
I was just commenting on Sam. I like very much I like very much the way you choose to selectively emphasize things in secular Islam. And I don't like very much at all to stick to things that are very clear to us. That's not good to discuss, because equality, as Ibrahim is saying, we know that man is not equal to woman in Islam. We know that. We know that man is superior. This is a clear text. We cannot argue with that. But what is the value of keep going back to this rather than creating something new? We create it. How to create it? That's the question. Emphasizing the positive thing, that dwelling on the negative things, that's not going to get us anywhere. Because there's certainly, we agree on the things we agree on, specifically the man and the woman equality. So how can you do Islam? How can you succeed in emphasizing the positive aspects and kind of ignoring the negative agreed upon issues?
I see the need of both. I think the scriptures and the concepts that are is not sensitive to our sensibilities today. It is against what we have agreed on as an international community, as human rights, as basic rights of a human being. I think things that are that clearly are defiant from religion to these concepts, I think we need to verbalize. First of all, I feel we need to verbalize our rejection of them. And it's not because we don't know that. It's not because it's not. Sometimes it is preaching to the choir. It's just because it becomes some sort of standing by to bullying. I think what got us to situations that we've never imagined, like the past 20 years, the past 5 years, have been a nightmare. I mean, if someone went to another planet and came back, and you tell them these stories, they wouldn't believe that this could have happened with the Islamic world, and could have been produced by the Islamic world. We always thought that this is an extreme worst case scenario that can never happen, and it happened with all its details, where women were sold from one country to another. I think the collective silence of many Muslims, with their internal rejection, they say, we all know that this is not good, we all know, but we don't need to talk about it because it's negative, it will stir controversy, it's a headache. I think that collective silence or passiveness have emboldened the bullies, have emboldened the extremists who have hijacked many of the religious agenda. And I think at the same time, doing only that is negative, and I think that's what you're referring to. If we only do that, then we're just destroying and we're not constructing. We need to right away construct the alternative and strengthen the natural path of religions they serve with their capacity, especially if language is included. They serve certain times for certain purposes, and they need those pioneers who will always advance them with all the edits that are needed, with all the cultural, natural evolution. You cannot stop evolution from happening to socially, to sociologically, to our to religion. Religion cannot be stagnant while everything else is moving. It becomes a cancer. So we need at the same time to keep that moving. Now, what have stopped that from moving? What have silenced? Why is Asr al-Nahda died? Why did it die? Why aren't the books of Muhammad Abdu in the bookstores? Why Ali Shariati was exiled from Iran and he was buried in London, and then when they wanted to move him back to Iran, the Iranian clergy didn't allow it, and they had to move him to Syria. Even his dead body, as a sociologist, revolutionary person, Ali Shariati, he was not allowed. I was the vice chairman of the Islamic House of Wisdom here in Dearborn Heights, and there was a speaker, when he saw the books of Ali Shariati were republished years after his death in Lebanon, in Beirut, and he saw them, that scholar, we saw these books are being sold, and at that time I was the educational officer, and he told me that if these books are not removed, then I will go back. I'm not going to speak. He was paid to speak for an engagement. He said, if these books are sold, I'm not going to speak, because these were critical to the Shia Islamic institution. This is something I personally experienced. Now this is one mufrada, this is one microcosm. Now imagine all the resistance against these voices. That's why I say I'm not going to rely on the Middle East much. Because we saw what happened to Nasser Abu Zaid. We see what happens. I mean, they literally become violent within the interview on the TV. Like, you don't even have to wait. They become violent in the interview on the TV. So I'm not going to rely on that. We need so much time where people are waking up from so much crisis, right? I mean, it's not them all the blame. But over here we have an opportunity. Now, the second generation, third generation after we have taken a breath from our refugee trips and immigrant trips, now we have an opportunity, other than producing doctors and engineers, to also produce academics who will restudy and have a kind of a renaissance from the West. That we've seen elements of it, but we need it at a wider scale. I think that is the optimistic view that can take place. Thank you.
So we have one more question, and if anyone has questions other than this, then you're welcome to. Yes, a quick one. Go ahead.
Right, I was just going to add, from my own personal experience, I'm born and raised in North America. I'm not too strong in Arabic. I can write Arabic just good enough to say hi to my cousins through text message. Right. So I'm educated in the mosques over here from as old as I can remember until last week. I was at the mosque. Right. I have never heard a speaker come up and say men and women are not equal. To the contrary, it's not just avoiding it, where you guys are equal, each have your rights towards each other, etc., 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 right? And if it was to ever happen, and I imagine there'd be for my generation at least that's raised over here, there'd be riots. You know, that mosque would not, either the mosque would have to kick the speaker out, or my generation would not attend there anymore. So societies do evolve. That's an example for me right there, where you're stating something that to you is a fact, or to me I'm like, what text is the guy talking about, right? That's also always taken into consideration when thinking about stuff.
I think you also have to consider the fact that the text came a long time ago, and although it's not completely, it doesn't treat women and men equally in a sense, but it was actually progressive for the time that it came in. So, I mean, before Islam came, some men used to bury their daughters. If they had a daughter, they would bury her. So for that time and period, I think it was progressive. Now, if you look back, now we're in the 21st century, obviously the tax doesn't apply in that sense. So I think what we need is more maybe women voices within the community, like more women in power. Unfortunately, most of the people who are in power within the Islamic community happen to be men. And maybe we just need more women. Hopefully they will be able to also start this discussion about equality and have their voices heard. So,
So our last question, and if anyone has other questions, you're welcome to ask during our break later.
So just a question about reinterpretation and its breadth for anyone who wants to answer. So let's take for granted that we can find a peaceful and secular and feminist interpretation of every verse in the Quran and Hadith. Like, we can do this, right? It seems to me that for people who have a lot of faith, the idea that the Quran is the perfect word of God, written in heaven by God, meant to be understood by the common person, is a very, very tempting belief, because it gives you a great deal of certainty and surety, and that will, that someone who believes that will tend to resist reinterpretation, saying like, well, the text says what it says, and I believe the text. So I'm wondering, like, how can reinterpretation like fundamentally win in the marketplace of ideas, especially if you might face a lot of opposition from, for example, powerful imams in Saudi Arabia and the like.
I mean, it's in the Middle East, it either has to be supported by the big religious institutions or by the government. And currently the governments are allied to, not to Islamic reform. And those secular ones are not influential in the mainstream movement of Islam, like Lebanon, for example. There are exceptions. The main countries, they are not allied to reform Islam. Reform Islam, reinterpretation of Islam is considered an exception. It's considered, when Tunis, which is the only successful country in its Arabic Spring, and Tunisia, probably the secret of Tunisia is the education that was emphasized by Bourguiba when it was, when there was a renaissance and he wanted 100% paid education for all Tunisians, undergrad, grad. He wanted, maybe that's what caused Tunisia to be different from its surroundings, but I'm not sure. But Tunisia today, it's kind of more progressive than other Islamic countries. And when it last made the Grand Mufti of Tunisia, the official source of giving fatwa of Islamic Sharia in Tunisia, gave one fatwa, which is Muslim women can marry non-Muslim men, just like Muslim men can marry non-Muslim women. There was an uproar in the Islamic world, and there was like Al-Azhar in Egypt have disclaimed that fatwa, and they said, no, you can't do that. And the Tunisian Mufti, he said, please, this fatwa is for Tunisians, it's not for all Muslims. So do not interfere with my people, I'll give them my fatwas. So even that, it's like they don't even accept the fatwa in a different country that goes. Nasser Abu Zayd was considered an apostate. His wife was divorced. He was treated, an apostate is treated like a dead person. So he's inherited, he's divorced automatically, etc. So there is in order for interpretations to become mainstream, they either need to be supported by a religious institution or by government. Now, if either of those are not, it's a revolution. And revolutions, they need time to make it through, especially in the Middle East, where most revolutions are tainted with conspiracy theories, etc.
I think the relationship in the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim war between power and religion is very complicated. But I think you need, either one of them, the religious institution or the governments, to do something. What struck me about a month ago, when Saudi Arabia said that we're going to permit women to drive cars, and you saw all these religious people coming in droves on TV to justify and to say, oh, there's nothing wrong with that, a woman can drive all along, and it's not against Islam. And as you see how complex it is, there is this idea that Islam is kind of like, especially religious leaders or people are the ones who are calling the shots. It seems to me that they also play sometimes a secondary role to those governments, as what happened in Saudi Arabia proved. Like those same people about a year ago, they were saying a woman cannot drive, and they were telling you theories about why, which were all like very stupid and weird theories, but nonetheless, now they're saying, oh, no, she can't drive. So this is a very complicated relationship, and I don't know, we need also sometimes some reformers who, will take this powerful and complex job and say, you know what, we need to reform, and we need to start from upside down.
Among this, just addition, just for you to know that among the things that happened in Saudi Arabia lately, if you've heard that wave of arrests, there were also Islamic reformers who were arrested just within this wave, like Al-Maliki and others who were in Saudi Arabia. They considered Islamic reformers, that they were jailed. Islamic reformers, we're not even talking about free thinkers or a long time ago in jail, but just Islamic reformers were very respected among Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists?